Good morning, Sarah. And good morning, listeners.
Or good afternoon, or good evening, or good night.
This podcast episode is all about good night. Let's start again. Ready?
Let's start
Boom,
again.
boom.
Boom, boom. That was terrible.
Okay.
Good morning, Stefanie.
Good afternoon, Sarah. That was a good intro.
That was a great intro. No fluff there, no fluff. We could just dive in.
Yeah, go for
We can
it.
just dive in because we first recorded an episode on boundaries. It was one of our early episodes, I think.
Yeah.
Was it in the first 10? It's probably not even on YouTube.
I think it was
our boundaries.
13 because I
Okay.
just referenced it to somebody recently. And that episode was what, 2.5 years ago? Maybe almost 3 years ago that we recorded it. And I've been wanting to re-record an episode on boundaries because my perspective on them has evolved, obviously, in 3 years. And I feel like we could do a whole new round of it. But this is a good compromise.
Well, it is boundaries that we're talking about, and boundaries and attachment, because attachment and our attachment styles does influence our boundaries. Like the two are connected. And you've just done, at the time of recording anyway, you're in the process of doing an email series about food and attachment styles. And I think you said you had a few questions of people wanting some more thoughts around boundaries.
Correct. So I'm going to be putting that email series actually up on my blog. And just for the benefit of anyone who's not familiar with attachment theory, so and how this is related to boundaries, the idea of rigid versus porous boundaries, or a mixture of both, or like the push and pull of both. We think about that in terms of food, like I have no boundaries with food, or I have extremely controlled and rigid boundaries around food, or again, the push pull. But how does that relate to attachment? Like I'm bringing these concepts together because I see them linked, and I have felt them really linked in myself, like in my own experience of how I feel about relationships, or how I feel inside of relationships, how I feel a sense of my own boundaries in some places really strongly, and in other places not at all. I mean, this is going back more. I don't feel them in that extreme way anymore. And how like I saw my food relationship like mimicking that, just the either severe lack of or extreme presence of boundaries.
Well, maybe then let's run through the attachment styles briefly and the boundary pattern that comes in with each attachment style. I mean, I have some knowledge of this, but I feel like it's fresher in your mind because you've just been
I
writing
love
about it.
attachment
So I
theory.
am going to give you the
I
baton for
I
this
have
one.
to admit, I'm kind of attaching to attachment theory in the same way that I attach a little to nervous system because
In what way? Are you doing it in an anxious way? Are you doing it in a disorganized way? Are you
No.
doing it in an avoidant way?
I'm
Or secure?
I'm running right. It's a secure one, and I do. It's an excitement. But I am really interested in it, and I'm excited about the connection. There's a whole training and certification you can get, which is like this is a little anxious attached. But yes, so attachment theory. This is something I learned in my like undergrad literally Psych 101 courses, but this comes from the experiment by Bowlby and Ainsworth, where a child and the mother are brought into a room, and it's a new environment for the child, and there's a stranger in the room, and the child is observed for their reactions and behaviors, and like sort of like what happens to the child when the mother is present versus when the mother leaves versus when the mother comes back. And this is an older experiment, but I used to work in a child psychology institute, and they were still recreating this experiment with various nuances in the early 2000s. So it was looking at, does the child move towards the mom for safety? Does the child move away from the mom for safety? Or does the child appear to be like disconnected or terrified, and the various things that this might say about the attachment to their caregiver, because our first concept of safety comes from our caregivers. The mother-child bond is extremely important for understanding the world, right? Like this is our template of the world. Our caregiver is the one who teaches us, like, is the world safe or is it not? Or this is where we're developing that sense or not, or some kind of confusion around it.
I would also say that the presence of another, is the first time we experience ourselves outside of ourselves. Does that make sense? Because we exist in relationship with other people. So the thinking is in child development that babies don't know that the world is separate from them. So anything that happens to them, how they're handled, how they're treated, They don't know that that's coming from another. We can't conceptualize it's another, so we feel like it's about us, which is why this attachment can be so early, like pre-verbal kind of thing. So about safety, I feel like it's also something which will tie in with safety, but about our experience of ourselves that develops in how we are treated.
Yes. So there's two types of attachment, secure and insecure, right? Which would be like healthy attachment and the unhealthy attachment. But there's three types of insecure attachment. Let's maybe talk first about what secure attachment is and what this sort of like healthy version of attachment is. And that would look like a child who sort of looks to the mom, who's kind of like with the mom in the beginning, knows where the mom is and is in touch with the mom, but is also feeling curious about the new environment and even the stranger, right? So is sort of like, I'm here with my mom. My mom's my safe zone. And once I feel like, all right, like my mom's right there, I'm going to explore now. I'm going to kind of move away from my mom and I'm going to play with the toys here. And I'm going to maybe look at the stranger and maybe eventually even approach the stranger, right? So it's this idea that we can engage with the world and with unfamiliar things and feel safe enough to do that because we know that our mom's there. We know that that's a secure base. And, we trust it. We sort of trust that she's there. And then when the mom leaves, it's this idea that the child may have a little bit of reaction to that. And there is some sense of like, what's going on, but then can reestablish and kind of has the flexibility to say like, all right, well, I still got this kind of thing. I'm not going to freak out about it. And I'm still going to sort of engage, maybe cautiously, but that's healthy, right? To sort of have some cautious curiosity. And then when the mother comes back, that the child can reunite with the mother without any resentment that she left and just sort of like, hey, mom, you're back. Yay. Kind of that there's not this feeling of like you abandoned me. So this is what secure attachment would look like, on paper in a perfect world, and how that relates to a healthy relationship with food is what?
Well, we're talking about relationship patterns and we have a relationship with food. So there's something, and I really like the word trust that you use because I think that's a huge part of it with attachment. The other person doesn't have to be perfect. We can recognize that it's going to wax and wane. It's almost like gray thinking. It's that gray middle of the road thinking, secure attachment, really. Whereas we'll get on to like the different types of insecure, that's more of the swings. So we would see that with food as well. The anxious attachment, well, I feel like it's harder for me to talk about in terms of food until we run through what the actual insecure ones were. But there's something about grasping for food, over grasping, and then cutting ourselves off. So there's the reaching for, and then there's the holding back, which was avoidant. And food insecurity,
right?
We know is a huge thing. Some people have experienced food insecurity because there wasn't enough of it growing up, or it wasn't coming at predictable times, or they were dieting or trying to restrict. Right. And so when we're talking about security, insecurity, we're going to play those patterns out with food as well, just with the secure attachment then. So we're kind of then defining this as we are attached. It's not like we don't care. And it's funny because sometimes when I have spoken to people about attachment styles, people who see themselves as insecure, and I'll say, what would a securely attached person, how do you imagine they would react in that situation? And the way they describe it is like they don't have any feelings.
Right.
Like, they just wouldn't care if someone rejected them. And they would be so strong in themselves. So I think sometimes if you are someone who sees yourself as struggling with attachment, you can have this idealized view of what secure attachment looks like. As if securely attached people somehow find this stuff easy. It's not easy to be in relationship with people.
Right. But that there is a trust in self and other, or even in the ability to, well, I suppose that's self-trust, but the ability to know that you'll get through it. So when it comes to food, I think about even with restriction, like this idea of being able to stop eating something when we're full because we know that it will be back later, and like we trust that it will be back later and that it won't be withdrawn. There's this understanding of this is a safe relationship I'm in with food. I trust it and I trust myself with it. But more interesting is insecure attachment. and probably more to the point of why people would be listening to this. Because if you're securely attached with food, why you're probably not here. Or maybe not. That's not actually true. Maybe you have worked on this and maybe you do have more of a secure attachment with food. And this might be a nice way of reflecting. And by the way, you and I here are talking about it through the lens of food, but I posit that these attachment styles can play out in a number of things. I mean, attachment theory is talked about in terms of relationships and people, but I think you could be attaching to food, you could be attaching to your body image or weight, you could be attaching to your job and your career and there's so many things that we can attach to, and these patterns can play out through. And we're using food today to talk about it, but it might apply in other scenarios as well. It's also worth noting that you might have a certain type of attachment, like an anxious or an avoidant, or attachment to one thing or one person, and a completely different one to a different person or in a different situation. So you're not always one kind of attachment, although frequently we tend to have patterns.
Yes, it can sound a bit black and white, can't it? And once people label themselves sometimes as insecurely attached, then they think, oh, well, I'm just broken. That's who I am. I am deficient somehow, and I'll never have a healthy relationship. And that's not true either. There's a flexibility in understanding this, and we can change our relationship patterns.
Yeah, I have.
Should we talk about what the insecure ones are?
Yes, let's talk about that.
As we've named them as such. So I'm happy to do avoidant because it's the one that I feel closest to. I think, again, in a lot of ways, I can be very securely attached, but if I go into insecure attachment, avoidant.
That's the way you go? Yeah. There's 3 types.
Yes. And then in the stranger experiment, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you've probably looked into this more recently than I have. My memory's a bit rusty. My memory of the avoidant attached child is that they seemed quite indifferent with mum leaving and with mum returning. So there was a detachment, an avoidance, if you like, of attachment to the mother. So therefore they seemed unaffected. So this would look like the traditional commitment phobe, or somebody who's just pretty independent, because that's what avoidance does, is it fosters and breeds independence. And of course there is a healthy level of independence as well. And you might move in and out of healthy independence and what Robert Holden calls pathological independence. Some of the belief patterns around the avoidant is no one's going to be able to meet my needs. No one's going to understand me. Like, there's no one for me. It's that kind of, I can only rely on myself. People are not reliable, is the baseline of the avoidant, would you say?
Yes, it's that mistrust, and also the defense mechanism of, okay, if I don't trust that someone's here for me or that they're not able to meet my needs, well, then I'm just not going to have any. And that's how I'm going to cope. So that independence and that indifference is not necessarily authentic indifference. It's not. I think it eventually probably feels like that. But initially, it's developed as a way of saying, I recognize that my mother's not emotionally available, or me having needs seems to cause a problem in my family dynamic or in this relationship or whatever. Therefore, I'm going to compartmentalize those things. I'm going to suppress them. I'm going to not need, because that's too vulnerable, because we all have needs. I mean, we all have needs for connection as human beings. So we start out with that need always. And if that need is consistently not getting met, then we learn that's rendering me too vulnerable. And so I have to shut that down. Interesting that I notice most working with clients that avoidants tend to be restrictors, which is interesting because you are not, which I'm not saying is impossible. But I don't know if you feel the same, but I've noticed that avoiders that I work with, tend to be the more restrictive type, because there is this tendency to be like, I don't need food. Hunger is vulnerability. I don't need that. I know how to turn the volume down on that. How do you experience it as a permitter? Or how did you?
Well, I think I believed that. I believed that I couldn't understand how my appetite could be more powerful than me. I did not, for a long time, see that honoring my appetite was a path that I wanted to go down, or believed that it was a path that I needed to go down. I thought I could be stronger than it. But I think then, if we're looking at attachment, how we attach and relate to different things, maybe my avoidant attachment was with myself. So maybe like my emotional landscape. So they talk about this in the binge eating research. They say that a lot of binge eaters, majority of binge eaters, are avoidant of their emotions. I'm not quite sure that I exactly buy it because I think that there are ways that it's phrased in the research which doesn't take into account a lot of things.
Yeah.
But there is an element of denying that I had needs for certain things and not knowing that the denial of those needs and that it was those needs that were then triggering binge urges. I hadn't put the two together. So that's how I think it played out for me.
Mm. I suddenly like, yes. So this is a good place where we can talk about, gosh, it gets really layered, but the book, the boundaries, right? Like, so we talk about rigid boundaries and porous boundaries. Traditionally, I conceptualize that as rigid boundaries restrict, porous boundaries permit. But when you're talking about avoidance of emotion, well, I can see how that would either become a rigid or a porous boundary in terms of with the food, because food will speak up for what's being suppressed, right? And it could, or it could not. I mean, that's the thing, is that there's not one size fits all to how food and boundaries are going to play out for someone. There's this such an intersection of factors. But what you're saying is that in avoiding emotions and self, that's getting pushed down, that's getting pushed down. And then almost like the food becomes the outlet or becomes the thing speaking up for those things. Because when we talk about people who are suppressing emotions, or when we talk about binge eating as a way of like, that's a manifestation of emotions that are getting suppressed, that would be how that would play out. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I don't know if you have, but I've worked with a number of clients who are more in the permitter camp. And their whole sense before we start working is that they're fine. They just eat too much, but they're fine. They're not having these emotional experiences that we can be so cut off from our experiences sometimes, I think, as avoidance, because we avoid ourselves too. Sometimes. Again, this is how it can show up because it can show up in different ways.
Mm. Right. So either food becomes the object of avoidance, or it becomes the spokesman for the avoidance.
Yeah. Because the belief is don't have needs.
Yeah.
It's too painful to have needs that can't be met. So don't have them. Do you want to give the listeners a bit of an overview of the anxious, insecure attachment, Steph?
Sure. All right. So anxious, insecure is almost like the opposite of avoidant, in that there is the opposite of shutting down and turning off and moving away. It's like more of a moving towards. So the insecure attachment style is, to bring it back to the experiment with the child and the mother, is where there is a clinging to the mother. So when the mother leaves the room, there is distress. I mean, as there would be some amount of like, what's going on here? But then that evolves into absolute distress and kind of like the not being able to cope with the separation, because there is some inherent lack of trust that maybe the mother will not return, or that the mother leaving means she doesn't care, or that we're not safe with the stranger. So there's just kind of a shutdown by way of moving towards, like, I'm desperate for the safety. I'm desperate for the safety. Where I need to find it. I need to find it. I need to go towards it. I need to move. Like, and this shows up in relationships as often clinginess, over dependence on another person, fear of abandonment, not ever wanting to be independent of, right? So there's an over identification sometimes with the other person. And a lot of seeking validation, a lot of seeking, like, kind of like, you still here, mom? You still here, mom? You still here, mom? You still here, mom? Because if there's a separation, then that's seen as a threat. Less curiosity, less movement towards novel things, less safety with something out of the realm of what is known and familiar. So with food, that can look like moving towards, needing it all the time, fear of being hungry, fear of needing, so much so that instead of walking away from the need and not having the need, that we're like, I will never need, I will always be taking it in. I will continue to eat and I'll never be hungry. I had a client say to me recently, I can't remember the exact quote, but it was so poignant. It was just a few words. It was just like, I'm afraid to be hungry. But it was so much more than just, I'm afraid to be hungry. And that can look like binging, but it can also look like overeating. And it can also look like just, how I've had some clients say to me, like, I never let myself get hungry. I never let myself feel that sense of hunger in my stomach. It feels threatening. I'm not sure if there's any other, I'm sure, because it's not always the case that an anxious attached is going to be more of a permitter and having these porous boundaries, which, by the way, again, when we're talking about boundaries, the avoidant would be more rigid in their boundaries and have like push away. Whereas the anxious would be more porous in their boundaries. Like people pleasing is a big one with anxious attached. Just sort of yes, 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 yes. Of course, I'll do this. I'll do that. I'll do that. Whatever you want, just to keep you here. I will sacrifice myself just to keep you here. I will eat and eat and eat and eat just to make sure I never feel like I'm hungry, to the extent that we are not serving ourselves.
So from a boundary perspective with the anxious, how do you think about it in terms of the boundary patterns that you see?
So lack of boundaries, porous boundaries, healthy boundaries allow us to say no to certain things, right? And to say like, no, I can't do that. And that's how we protect our own space. It also doesn't, a healthy boundary doesn't have such rigid boundaries that we can't let anything in. But with the anxious attached, boundaries are almost non-existent, where maybe somebody doesn't even understand their own boundaries because there's just such a desperation to have whatever the thing on the outside is and the safety that represents, that we chronically cross our own boundaries. And this will come up as a lack of self-trust. Like, I don't trust myself because I know that I don't have boundaries, that I won't know where to even put those in or what they are, because what's more meaningful to me is just having the thing come in, come in, come in, come in, even at the expense of myself.
So then would you say that the anxious attached is likely, obviously it's always fluid, to be more people pleasing than the avoidant?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Because I guess the pattern, I'm just thinking with food and with time with boundaries as well, with the real people pleasers, is sometimes when you spent all day saying yes, yes, yes to others, you're saying no to yourself all the time. When you're saying yes to others without any kind of consideration for yourself and your own needs, you're saying no, no, no to yourself. And it made me think of that pattern of then food becomes the one way of like, well, this is me time. Like it's the one moment that the rebel can come out because it's not in relationship with other people.
Yeah.
So it can then play out from a food perspective in that way.
Yes. So again, it's like looking at, is food the object of the anxious attachment, or in the same way we talked about this with avoidant, is the food the object of the attachment, or is it the spokesman
Yes.
of the help, right? So that you're just presenting that opposite switch where, because it doesn't always mean that you're attached to the food or that you're avoidant of the food. It could be that the food becomes the thing that says, hey, we don't have good boundaries, whether they're too rigid or too porous. Like something needs to change here. I'm speaking up on behalf of the attachment to this concept itself.
So just because from the last episode that we did, you've moved on a lot in your thinking, what is a food boundary to you? Like, what does that mean, the idea of food boundaries now from
Yeah.
your perspective today?
So when we recorded that episode, again, it was 3 years ago, just about. So I was only 2 years into recovery. This was before I had a gentle nutrition course, because at the time, boundaries still felt a little bit scary to me. I still, I understood cognitively that they weren't rules, but I still felt something of a rule inside of the discussion of boundaries. And I remember you didn't. I remember I don't know what you felt, but the way that you presented boundaries was very like the way I think about it now. But at the time, I was still very much, because remember, my restriction wasn't that long ago at that time. I mean, it's still 5 years ago, but at the time it was only 2. And there was something, so I remember I had a hard time even talking about boundaries without feeling like I was betraying something that was like, no, 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 Whereas now, those things, like having food boundaries, meaning, sometimes like meal structure, or simply saying, I'm going to pass on the ice cream tonight or something like that, like, isn't scary to me. It feels like, yeah, well, that makes sense given my larger goals and taking care of myself. Like, I don't want to go to bed and feel sick, or just I had enough today. I don't need to have the ice cream just because I can. Whereas before, I think I leaned a little bit more towards what, cognitively, again, I didn't, but I still felt that sense. So I think there's a time element to being able to feel safer in your own boundaries, which makes sense too when you think about relationships. If you've had a breach in a relationship in some way where the trust is broken, you don't just make an apology and come back into that relationship and simply trust that person. There might be some skepticism. There might be some I trust you, but I also, like, I don't know, in the back of my head, I'm still cautious. And it takes time for that trust to build back up. And so it is with the relationship with food and our bodies as well. So having these healthy boundaries with food now is like, I can, like, saying no, just saying no, thank you. Ordering a salad at a restaurant because I really like salads. What did I have recently that I was like, oh, I had a Quest bar. You know, did you have, those Quest
Yeah,
bars?
yeah, I know Quest bars, yeah.
I used to have those like as just to like stave off hunger in a way that was restrictive. And I eat Quest bars now and again when I'm running errands and I need something to get me through until I get home or something like that. But even that would be something that I wouldn't necessarily have allowed myself to have because it felt like I was going into this territory that now I have safety around. You know, it's just like, no, just I need some protein in my body to help me get through to my next meal. Or sometimes actually, if I'm a little bit, now I'm caution any listener that to again once remember that like my trust in myself is super secure. When I might be like finishing a call at 5 o'clock, let's say if I have a later afternoon and I finish a call and I come out of my office and I'm a little bit hungry, I'm hungry, I'm like hungry, and I'll say I'm going to wait till dinner. Because at that point, I don't want to have a snack when I'm going to have dinner an hour later, or I'm going to start making dinner. And instead of like munching as I'm cooking, I'm going to say like, no, I'm going to wait until dinner because I want to sit down to a full meal and give myself that full plate of food because I know that it doesn't feel good when I snack. And then I get to dinner and I'm like, oh, now I'm not even as hungry anymore. And now it just ruins the experience for me. That wouldn't have felt safe for me to do before because I would have been like, you're hungry, you better eat. But now it's like, no, yes, I'm hungry, but I also know I'm going to be eating very shortly. And this is not restriction. It's like, I trust the mom to come back. You know what I mean? There's a very strong security in that. So it's not scary. I'm not the anxious or the avoidant. That's kind of like, I don't know, my mom left and I don't know. Now I somehow have to turn into myself. So those are just a few examples of how this shows up now and how much easier it is to talk about it. Because my body's like, yeah, like, yeah, I fully trust.
So what would you say to somebody who perhaps feels closer to how you did 3 years ago, that this talk of boundaries creates that feeling in their body? They can rationally understand what boundaries are and that they may not be rules and how they could look, but they have that feeling about them. How would you speak to someone from your perspective today?
It's so boring. It's so boring.
Then don't say it. Don't say it. Let's just move on.
Yeah. It's actually something that Mike, my husband, was actually the one that helped me with this the most. It was not something I read in a book or got online or social media. He would always just remind me, he was just like, just keep going. Like, just keep going. Just keep putting one, don't stop overthinking it. Like, let time pass, and that's literally, it's just keep doing what you're doing. Just keep doing what you're doing. Just keep doing what you're doing, provided that the doing is restorative and, building trust and safety in the body. Which was continuing to eat my meals and continuing to, if I did have too much fear, for example, I had at that time come out of my office at 5 o'clock and felt hungry and felt that fear come up, I may have needed to eat. I may have needed to have that snack and then have dinner. And it was kind of just not pathologizing what was happening in my nervous system around these things and not trying to force it to be farther along than it was, and to allow that trust to continue to develop through the relationship I was forming with myself and the relationship that you're forming with yourself over time. It is the consistency that you're showing up with, and that you're not rushing yourself to go somewhere too fast, but that you're also giving yourself permission to keep exploring it. That I think is it. That's it. It's just to continue, just to keep moving.
Well, I think it speaks to this idea of recovery as this maybe almost continual, maybe continual work in progress.
Yeah.
Like, I still feel like you can look at a point and go like, okay, I'd recovered by this point, but there was still healing. There was still more going on. And I think people put so much pressure on themselves that recovery should look and feel like this. And if they're having these feelings or this thread of safety coming up around food, it's rearing its head again. Oh, that means I'm not recovered. And that means I'm going backwards. And
yes, which is will distract you from, where you're going or
and
the direction.
Yeah. And distract you from talking about attachment styles as well. So the next one, the last one being
Right.
disorganized.
Yeah. Well, this one's a little easier to talk about just because it's pretty much like it's a push-pull between the two styles of that we just mentioned. So it's at times avoidant and at times anxious. It's also at a little bit of a different dimension. They also call it fearful, but essentially behavior-wise, it looks like a disorganization of these two other styles together. And there's an inconsistent pattern of just the dynamic of push-pull, which to me feels so much like my experience with food in that it was such a binge restrict. It was both, and it was equally both. And there were times where I used food, I went towards food so much, and there were times where I rigidly pushed it away so much. And that roller coaster was representative of a disorganized attachment style, which is where, we might move towards someone and then feel like terrified of that vulnerability of moving towards that way, then pull away. And it's kind of what it sounds like.
Mhm. Yeah. And you shared in your emails about relating to this disorganized attachment style that feels not where you are now.
Mm.
But from a developmental perspective, then, any idea where that came from?
Yeah, I think about this because just disorganized attachment is supposed to be the most
Traumatized.
traumatizing one and also the hardest to break out of. And I'm like, well, geez, because I didn't. I mean, my parents were inconsistent between themselves. In that my dad was, well, he was quite inconsistent himself. I mean, now we're getting into therapy here, but like he was hot and cold, but from a critical point of view. But he was always warm affectionately. I always trusted his presence. Whereas my mother was a much more avoidant type. My mom is guarded, and I needed her so much. And I feel like it came more actually from well, I can't even say that. No, it's not true. But I do feel like it was just probably a combination of my parents' styles of being, which is not anything wrong with them. It's just how they were, combined with my sensitivity and my needs as an oldest child. And I do think that some of it had to do with me being oldest child, and particularly the oldest daughter, because I think when you're the leader, so to speak, you're the oldest, you don't have a peer to help you feel like, is this okay? Are we good? So you're constantly looking to your parents, and you're expected to know what you're doing and to be like others are looking to you. And I think that to a sensitive person, that feels like a lot. And you don't know what's going on necessarily. And also, yeah. So I think that I got very disorganized just because I didn't know what end was up a lot of times. And I also didn't get some needs met by virtue of just like what my mom's needs were, which is why I have so much compassion for her and for myself now as a mom. Because it doesn't mean you have a bad parent. It just means that there's inconsistencies.
Yes. And we can cut this part out if you want. But also when we're talking about in degrees, because you said this period of time, particularly when your attachment style felt pretty disorganized, you maintained a marriage. And and no one says, I know this idea like what's a stable marriage?
No, it is
most
stable.
marriages aren't easy. And was it throughout?
Yes. Okay. So God bless Mike. I had all my relationships prior to Mike were completely disorganized, and I loved avoidance actually. And I would go towards avoidance and I would become anxious. But then if they ever came back towards me, if they ever showed signs of like giving me back what I wanted, I ran away. Like, so there was definitely unhealthy attachment happening prior. Mike, in the same way that I was like, I need to recover. I'm going to read this book and recover. I had this moment in my life where I was like, I need to stabilize. Like, I need to organize. And I really do. I did not, of course, think of it this way, but I remember being like, I need to go find somebody who's going to be an anchor. And I did. And Mike was not the kind of guy I was attracted to, but I had this instinctive, like, I need somebody like this. And he was, and he is. And he's like, he doesn't let me, he has healthy boundaries himself. So he taught me that. And I pulled with him frantically in the beginning. And he just kind of sat there. Like, it didn't bother him. It didn't come into he didn't soak it in as like abandonment. He didn't soak it in as over attachment. He just sort of stood and like let me do what I needed to do, and he didn't waver. He was like my new mom. So, like I mean this, I mean, we can leave it in, because I'm okay with it. He became the new force of what teaching me this healthy boundary meant. So I sort of was like, I'm not getting it. I didn't get it in childhood here. I'm not getting it through all these unhealthy relationships that I'm choosing. Let me choose differently. And when I chose differently, I was able to learn, and I was able to, and now we don't have that dynamic. I don't do that. I was going to say dramatic with him, which is what I used to be. I was quite dramatic, and I was so volatile. And this doesn't exist for us anymore. A little bit. Sometimes I'm like, and I'll be like, and I'm like, I know. Like, I'm aware of it, and it's funny sometimes now, but it used to be not funny. And anyway, so all of that to say that I changed, but I really think I had a readiness to. And I think that at the time I was like, I need this. So I moved against the grain of what my like instincts were, which was to go towards people who didn't want me back.
Well, a lot of the rhetoric around insecure attachment points to a lot of this stuff can change through relationship with securely attached people.
There you go.
So it's the job of the securely attached people to fix those of us that are insecurely attached. That's the yin and yang of the world.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's essentially what happened. And I also think, in therapy and in coaching, right? Like sometimes we repair these kind of dynamics. We can repair these kind of dynamics in any relationship we have. It doesn't have to be a spouse or a mother, or a parent. It can be friends, where again, it's not going to heal the whole soul necessarily, but it's almost like modeling what healthy boundaries are in relationships, and having them and upholding them is sometimes where a person might first really experience them, in the inside of that relationship. So I think there's lots of opportunity to create healthy relationships with healthy people, with people who have healthy boundaries rather, and learn.
Yeah. And like anything, it's a pattern. And understanding, recognizing our patterns. I think my friendships have been a big part of work I've done on my, let's say, vulnerability to avoidance. Because previously, my thing would be if I felt someone pull away from me, shutters come down, I'm gone.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not coming to find you. If you pull away from me, if you don't want me, I don't want you harder.
Yeah. Right.
And I had a few experiences with friendships. And this was, while I've been in therapy and stuff like that, where we would talk about it. And let's say, I don't know, a friend was upset about something and they withdrew, and I took a step forward. And I remember like how uncomfortable that was to take that step forward and to go, are we okay? Is there something you want to say? So it was really interesting having that experience of just deciding to step forward, because it felt like a very kind of adult here and now decision that, someone's pulled away and I don't know why. And rather than pull the shutters down, I'm just going to step forward and see if I can see why. And maybe I can, and maybe I can't. And maybe it is like we're going to go our own ways. And that really felt okay. And I had a couple of experiences like that with friendships, I think, that have really helped with that tendency. And anyway, I think there could be
the same for food, right? So you're talking about that, like you're taking the opposite action, kind of. And I think you can apply this right to working on your relationship with food, where the instinct might be to restrict or binge. Binge is a little bit different because it can be driven by impulses beyond our control, but where it is more of a perimeter or porous boundary binge, that it's doing the opposite, taking the opposite action of the instinct, because that instinct feels like the safest thing and like the thing you're supposed to do. That viscerally feels so difficult to do it opposite. And I want to actually maybe say that like that's easier and maybe more productive to do when it's when the instinct is to restrict and to move back on that. Whereas when the instinct is to binge and then to not, can feel a little bit like white knuckly and might be a little bit different. Giving yourself the time to pause and like not just react, and to be like, okay, what would the healthy boundary be here?
Yeah. It's being more intentional. And then it's things like now, if I walk away from something, I'm almost over analyzing it first, because I'm thinking, is this my avoidant stuff coming out? I'm someone, I tend to dip in and out of therapy, and I went into therapy for a few months to work on all this home stuff. And the last few weeks in therapy, I kind of thought, I'm not sure that this is what I need right now, but am I just Am I just avoiding something? And I had to really sit with it. And I even spoke to my therapist about it.
Mm,
Anyway, I'm gonna step out of therapy again for a while, and I'll step back in when I need it. But even if it's partially informed by a tendency towards
yeah.
avoidance,
Yeah.
all I can do is pause
Yeah.
and question and try and center myself and go, does this feel okay with me? Does this feel like I'm avoiding something? To get a little bit still with that
Yeah.
decision. And that's the best I can do. Like,
Yes.
my level of awareness.
Yes. And it's the same with, I mean, again, we're talking about food and we're talking about attachment because you don't have to do it perfectly. Same thing. It's like you don't have to get it right. And sometimes our tendency is what our tendency is. I lean a lot more of, can be more avoidant like. I'm not attaching, I'm not clinging anymore, but I can pull back. And sometimes I do catch myself doing that in different scenarios, but I can also course correct or, you know what I mean? Or be like, yeah, this is kind of a part of me in a way, but then I sort of like figure it out from there in the same way that sometimes I'll regulate, and it's kind of like, oh, but it doesn't become so extreme. You know what I mean? It's like, is there a tendency to do this? Yeah, there can be, but are we getting lost in it? And is it becoming more than it needs to be? Or can we find our way back? Yeah. You know what I mean? And,
Mm.
and the other last week, I had an episode where I was like, oh, I want to, my nervous system is like way up here. I'm completely overwhelmed. And I was like, okay, I think like regulating would have been there. And I was like, I was just like, yeah, I can completely understand the instinct towards food right now, but I don't need to do that. And it would have just been like munching on a few things. It wasn't like a binge or an overeating issue, but it was just even that, even just, so change continues to happen. And I think that it evolves as you are recovered. It's not like you have to arrive there complete.
Yes. Amen. I think it's probably time for us to wrap up the episode, but now I'm worried that that's just my avoidance talking.
No, I'm feeling it as well.
Well, that just makes me
Well,
want to cling on.
um,
Feeling
but
very
if this,
disorganized right now. Let's wrap it up.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, if this was of interest to you, or if you want to hear us talk more about rigid and porous boundaries, please do let us know what kind
Mhm.
of specific questions you have, because I feel like this conversation is pretty vague and broad and could be narrowed down if there are specific things for us to pick up on.
Sure could.
Let us know
All right.
below.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, ciao.
Okay. All right, Stephanie. Thanks. Thanks for
Okay.
showing up today.
Hey, you're welcome.
And I'll see you soon.
Yeah, yeah.
Bye.